briefly about each of those four things that we talked about. And I'm going to start by talking about inclusion. We talk about inclusion particularly, and we do name this as being inclusive of those who identify as LGBT+. It isn't just about LGBT+ inclusion. We're talking about race there. We're talking about gender there. You will have noticed maybe already tonight that we've changed some of the words in one of those songs to make it a genderless God. So we talk about inclusion in the whole, but particularly around this idea of LGBT+, which we believe to be one of our distinctives. And I was thinking about what I could talk about when I was talking about this tonight. And I was thinking, well, I could go through what's sometimes known as the clobber verses, the verses that people pull out of the Bible in order to say that people who identify as LGBT+ aren't in and shouldn't be included. I thought I could do that because we've got this course at Waterloo called Belonging Again, and it's a 4-week introduction to the church for those who identify as LGBT+, and it's a secure space, a safe place, only for those who identify it like that. And then I go in on the first week and I do the theology bit, right? So I stand up for 25 minutes and I go through all of those clobber verses one by one, and I say, this is why we have a different theology on this kind of stuff. So I thought I could do that. I could whistle-stop tour through all of the theology behind it. But I thought what I won't do is that. What I'll do instead is I'll tell you a really quick story about my friend Matt. My friend Matt grew up in a standard kind of conservative evangelical church, and very early on he realized that he was gay, and as a teenager he really wrestled with all this kind of stuff, and eventually as he left home he ended up leaving the church, and he was always wrestling with these two sides of his character. There was one side of him which was that he knew he was a person who loved Jesus. At the same time, he knew that he was a gay man, and he couldn't find any church that would allow him to reconcile those two things. And then he found out about Oasis Church Waterloo, and he came along on a Sunday morning, and we've got some steps leading up to the front door at Oasis Waterloo, and Matt came along and he stood at the bottom of the steps, and he couldn't bring himself to go any further. Because he stood there and he said, I thought, if this isn't the church I'm led to believe it is, this is it for me in Christianity. And he said, I stood at the bottom of the steps and I prayed and I said, God, if this church isn't what it says it is, if I'm not included here, me and you are through. I'm giving up on all this. And he said he finished the prayer and he stood there and he couldn't bring himself to go in because he couldn't bring himself to come into a place where him and God were through, in his words. And so he just stood there, paralyzed, not wanting to walk away, not being able to go in. And eventually he walked away. And the next Sunday he came back and he stood at the bottom of the steps and he prayed the prayer. And he couldn't bring himself to walk in. And he stood there for 20 minutes and he walked away again. And that same thing happened for 6 consecutive weeks, until on the 6th week, he got off the tube and he walked across the road, and 2 other people who didn't know him and are new to church just said, oh, you going to church? What's your name? Yeah, I'm Matt. And he just got swept up in this conversation. And before he knew it, he was up the steps and he was in. 6 years after walking up those steps for the first time, Matt walked up those steps again in a very different environment, because he had met a guy also called Nathan. They had got together. This was the days before same-sex marriage was legalized, and they were going to have a civil partnership ceremony. And they said to our church leadership team, would you pray for us before we go down for the civil partnership? Would you pray for us, just because we can't get married in the church, which is what we always wanted to do, but at least, and we can't have any religious elements in this civil partnership service, but like at least we'd feel like we'd done something. And Steve, who used to lead the church before me, he said, no, we won't. And Matt and Nath were shocked, and he said, we're not going to do that. We're going to throw you a wedding in everything but the legal document. And so they went down to the town hall and they had a civil partnership. And Matt and Nath walked up those steps and they walked in through those doors, and we basically married them. And I was playing the guitar that day, not doing this job. And I am a working class man from a South Wales mining town. My grandparents were a miner and a steel worker. I feel like I'm your kind of classic, like emotionless man. And I was in bits when they walked up the steps, I have to be honest. And they walked in through the door, and I was like, how am I even going to see the chords to play this guitar? Because it was an incredible moment. It felt like I was involved in something important and something special. So what is the theology behind why we are affirming towards those who identify as LGBT+? It's pretty simple. It's some verses from Matthew. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together, and one of them, an expert in the law, said, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." We believe in a God of love, a God who loves every single one of us, a God who doesn't put limits on involvement. And this is important, a God who says LGBT plus people can preach, they can lead kids' church, they can lead churches, they can be the leaders of churches, they can do anything and everything else. A God who always calls every one of us in, regardless of what Christians might have told us, regardless of what we might have told ourselves. A God who calls us to love and to love everyone exactly the same. I'm going to hand over to Joe, who's going to talk about the second of our four distinctives.